Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Aging and Culture lecture. This is a short lecture because we obviously can't discuss every single culture within our nation within a 3-hour course time. So there are some added resources for you posted on Blackboard to get the discussion going on what defines culture, what defines culture and aging, and how certain communities or different cultures view the aging process and view elders. So we're going to talk today about communicating across cultures, and then more specifically, what we're focusing on today is just aging across different cultures. And what makes our course unique is that we have a really diverse group of individuals who are going to be able to bring to the discussion about the different cultures that we have living here in Canada and how they view aging. And then maybe we can at some point now compare and contrast that to the Canadian society and how Canadians maybe view aging. And then we're also going to look at aging within the healthcare system, because aging in the healthcare system, culture is a really big, plays a very big role in how the older population is cared for. So first we would have to define our culture, right? So we have to identify what certain aspects of ourselves define a culture. And as we go through this course, it is important to identify that you may identify with a culture that you weren't necessarily born into, and that's not wrong. So for example, I would say our classroom is a culture, right? So we are all college students. And so that is, in a way, a culture because you have shared values and shared beliefs, right? So defining culture can be nuanced and it can have various aspects included. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it is based on a country of origin or a religion. So this is an image of an iceberg, and you can see that there's some things that you can see that are above the surface of the water and some things that you can't see that's below the surface of the water. So this is representative of how we see culture in different people, right? So the visible culture, the things that people can see are, our language, our color of our skin, the way that we present ourselves, the food that we eat, the art that's in our home, the way we dance, and certain traditions. So the things that people see about us then can identify maybe a culture that we come from, right? Whereas the stuff that's below the surface of the water that we can see is also really big indicators of the culture that we identify with, right? So we have those invisible culture is those things like our beliefs and our values and the way that we view the world. And then even below that, things like common humanity. So we all have all of this is in common, right? So the aspects that are above the water and things that people can see could be different for so many people. However, the invisible culture in ourselves and our common humanity could be very similar for a really large group of people that have a different visible culture, right? So if I were to use myself as an example, I come from two immigrant parents. One is German and one is West Indian, and I live in Canada. So I identify with 3 different countries when it comes to my culture. And some of those areas I identify with more. I identify myself more with the West Indian culture because I'm around it more. I didn't know much about my father's side. And I also identify very highly with the Canadian culture because that's where I went to school. So everybody can identify with different cultures. So what is culture? Specifically, culture is a complex system of values, traits, morals, and customs, and it's usually shared by a society, right? So if we were to discuss the Canadian culture, Canadians value being polite and kind, and that is shared amongst everybody here. We do try to be a diverse country, and that is a shared value amongst many people. Culture ultimately teaches people how to behave. And that's a really key point because every culture actually has rules that they have that shape their culture. So generally, a culture teaches people how to behave in certain situations or within their family or within their society. And then culture is now shaped by the attitudes we learn as a child, and then we later internalize as adults. So the interesting concept about culture is that we are not necessarily born a culture, but rather we are taught to be a part of a culture, right? So it depends, because I could be born in a different country, but I could have moved within the first few months of my life, and I will never recognize myself as that part of my culture, right? So yes, we are born into a country, but the culture is generally aspects, attitudes, and behaviors that we learn. Okay, so there's 5 characteristics of culture. The first one is that culture is learned. So that kind of speaks to what I was saying in the last slide. Culture, like I said, when we're babies, we're born into a culture, we are born into a country, we're born into a family. But ultimately, as we keep aging, we are taught the rules and the way to behave within our cultures. So again, if you look at children who have been adopted from other countries at a very young age, they might not identify themselves with the culture that they were naturally born into, but rather the rules and the behaviors of the culture that they are now living with, right? So culture ultimately is learned and passed down to our children and to the next generation and to the next generation. So it is up to us, if we have strong values in our culture, to make sure that those values continue on. Right? So especially for my parents who are immigrants and anyone else who is an immigrant, if you want to continue to live in Canada but have your strong beliefs of the country in which you came from, those would have to be taught to your children, right? Especially if they're younger and growing up in a different society. The second characteristic of culture is that it is inherently logical. And so what that means is that our culture is generally based on the rules that we had as children, right? So rules within the culture are what reinforce and honor that culture. So sometimes certain rules are what allow us to identify with a specific culture. And that's maybe where you would see things like traditions and customs, things that certain cultures do. And if we were to discuss this in a concept of religion, it could be the same thing as celebrating certain aspects within that religion or within that culture and doing certain things each year that reinforce that culture, right? So there's a lot of cultures who don't wear certain clothes throughout the whole year, but during a celebration, they wear the clothes of their culture. Right? So it's reinforcing those rules. The third characteristic of culture is that it is a basis of self-identity and community. So there are lots of individuals who will identify with a culture, and it might not be the country that they were necessarily born into, right? So again, we do see this a lot with immigrants. If they moved from their home country at a very young age, they might find their self-identity within the community that they're currently in, right? So their culture, again, like myself, is very Canadian. Like I grew up with all Canadians, or at least first or second generation Canadians. And so our self-identity is based on that, even though the food and the traditions that I have might come from a different country. Right? So ultimately though, we do make a lot of our choices based on our primary culture. Right? So again, even if you have moved, a lot of our rules, our behaviors, our customs and traditions come from our primary culture. And then we allow other aspects of other cultures to come in. But it really is, for a lot of people, and you might not identify this way, but a lot of people identify with their culture. That is their self-identity. The fourth characteristic of culture is that it combines those invisible and visible aspects that we just talked about a few slides back, right? So it combines the way we dance and speak and and the way we act and dress with the other invisible aspects like our morals and values, right? So majority of the time our culture is all encompassing and it includes all of those aspects, right? So we have our morals and our values, but we will often go towards our language, our dance, our art, and our traditions as well. So culture combines both the visible and invisible aspects. And then finally, what I find most interesting when I do any research on culture is that culture is dynamic, meaning it's constantly changing over time. And so it changes because of things like immigration or any other things that are going on in the world, because we are possibly born into a country, we identify with that culture, we've lived with that culture our whole life, and then we choose to move. So, for example, when I moved to Australia for a short period of time, I really wanted to adopt their cultural beliefs. Like, I really wanted to be a part of that country. And so my culture changed, right? So it became an opportunity of being dynamic. And so all of our cultures tend to change over time because of the changes that are happening within our world. And again, immigration is another big aspect. When we move, we continue to keep a lot of our morals and values because those don't change all the time, but we adopt new values and beliefs based on the country or the culture in which we're living within. So we have this concept called ethnocentrism, and ultimately that is the evaluation of other cultures, right? And so the reason I bring this up today is that when we are in a diverse group, we have a tendency to evaluate other cultures based on what we have seen, based on the certain standards or customs of our own culture, right? So we have our own beliefs and values and behaviors, and when we have those beliefs, values, and behaviors, we try to understand the rest of the world. We try to understand where everyone else is coming from, right? So we tend to evaluate other cultures based on an assumption, right? So a lot of us, especially in an educated group like our own, we will always do more research and ask lots of questions and try to be a part of understanding different cultures. But it's hard to understand another culture if we're not living within it, right? So sometimes we see that people react to other cultures in a manner that, in a way that they would want them to behave, right? So we expect others to react as we would, and they expect us to behave as they would, right? So we have to have this understanding. And the reason I bring this up here is that when working with the elderly population in such a diverse city, we would have to understand that what they might be viewing on their part and what we are understanding of their culture. And so ethnocentrism is an opportunity for us to better understand that people are looking at us to behave in a certain way as much as we might be looking at them to behave in a certain way. And what this ultimately means is that misunderstandings happen. And so with that, we have to be respectful. And it is important, especially in our current climate, that we understand that there's misunderstandings, and our opportunity is to educate, and we also have the opportunity to just listen, right? So working with a diverse population, especially the older population, if they have a cognitive decline, and respecting their culture at the same time can be quite difficult in the healthcare setting. And so an example of ethnocentrism is that we tend to make false assumptions based on certain cultures. And the example I have here is that we often view Americans as violent because of the mass shootings and certain situations, especially that are going on in the States right now. But that we have to also be respectful in understanding that that does not represent all Americans, right? So ethnocentrism is based on the fact that what we see, we might have expectations and assumptions about a culture based on what we see, and we have to know that those are false assumptions and that we would have to make changes on our side to better educate and to listen to better understand them. So if you take a break and you were to stop and think for just a minute, you could think about this, and then maybe you can write it down and talk to one of our classmates. Maybe you can go through the discussion board and have this discussion. But just think about a time that someone made an assumption about you based on your culture, and just think about how that made you feel. And did you do anything to educate them about your culture? Okay, so as you're going through this lecture, this just is something that you can keep in the back of your mind to think about. Just think about an assumption that was made about you. How did that make you feel? And what did you do to educate someone about your culture? So ultimately, we want to achieve intercultural proficiency, and it can be done as best as possible by not making any assumptions, right? So just avoiding those assumptions altogether by recognizing the differences in people. And I think that especially in our class, in our group, we are recognizing that there is such a diversity and that we can learn from so many of us. And it is also important to just also recognize our own personal biases. So how do we view some cultures? Think about how you view that culture. Are those negative, false assumptions that you believe? Why do you believe it? And just start to ask yourself questions as to what is your knowledge of those cultures? And then ultimately, you want to try and increase your sensitivity to certain situations, right? So when working with the elderly population in a diverse setting, all of this has to play a role, especially if you're working with individuals who are cognitively impaired, who might have a different viewpoint on different cultures, and how are we going to work with those individuals if it becomes a situation that is uncomfortable, right? So how are we going to have that discussion, and what are the steps are we going to take? So we've identified what culture is. And there's, again, when it comes to our own culture, there is no right or wrong answer. I don't know sometimes what my culture is. I know that it is dynamic, and I know that the beliefs and values that I have are learned from my parents and from my culture. But now let's look at it in a sense of the elderly population and how their culture impacts aging. So living arrangements is actually one of the bigger issues that we would need to be working with here in Canada to better understand, because the Canadian system tends to really have a high focus on long-term care and retirement, but culturally there's a lot of cultures that are not interested in moving into those facilities as they age. And so we have to be ready for the diversity of living arrangements for the older population, right? So this is a question for you to think about. What type of living arrangement do you see for yourself, or for your parents, or for your grandparents? It could be how was the living situation in your home country? Do you see a difference now living in Canada? Would that living arrangement be different? How would you find care for your elderly loved one? Right? So I know that if we were living in Guyana, my grandmother most likely would have been living with us, whereas here in Canada, she wanted to maintain her independence and wanted to live on her own. And so the safest way was for a retirement home. So what type of living arrangements occur in your culture? So living arrangements generally are decided upon through the family, and it is important to understand that those who immigrated to Canada are less likely to live independently. Canadians who have been here for several generations tend to have older adults live independently with the assistance of home care, whereas the most recent immigrants tend to live with family. They generally live with their adult children. And sometimes there is also a living arrangement that looks somewhat like a workplace, in the sense that grandparents would live in with adult children to either provide the caregiving, the cooking, or taking care of the house. So these are common occurrences we see with families that have immigrated to Canada. We see that more Canadians live more independently and are more welcome to the idea of long-term care and retirement, whereas immigrant families tend to live with their families together. So there's two ways that people can integrate into the community. One of them is called cultural enclaves, and the other one is called institutional completeness. And so the reason we're looking at this is that individuals within our older population who are trying to live as independent as possible need certain assistance as they age. And so cultural enclaves is that individuals who want to live independently would feel more comfortable clustered together with their cultural group in a geographical area. They would feel more confident and more comfortable if they were surrounded by aspects of their culture, right? So like in our city of Toronto, we have different areas within our city that have maybe, like, for example, Little Italy has a higher Italian representation. So an Italian immigrant might feel more comfortable being around an area that they can speak their language, eat the food that is something that is recognizable to them and that they know, and they would feel more safe and more comfortable clustered together with their culture. Whereas the other option that individuals do is institutional completeness, which is where they would feel more comfortable to age independently. And it has nothing to do with culture, but rather the opposite, where they are near certain services, resources, such as friends and family that are close by. So they would feel safe and comfortable as long as the programs and certain aspects are nearby, including something along the lines of their religious institutions as well. Okay, so cultural enclaves is more along the lines of clustering together in an area where the aspects of culture are really strong, so that they feel comfortable to speak their language, to know that the food is something that is culturally theirs. Whereas institutional completeness means that they would rather live in close proximity to family, friends, and other support systems that can support them as they age. So in the next slide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to just stop and think about how someone with a cultural enclave or institutional completeness would integrate into a community. Right? So if you're looking at, again, living arrangements, you're thinking about a culture, thinking about maybe it's a new immigrant family, or maybe it is a family that has been around for a long time. How would they integrate into the community in a cultural enclave or in an institutional completeness? Also, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of these? Right? So this is in the idea that individuals are choosing to age independently. They want to be a part of their culture. Which option is better? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these? So this would be an opportunity. You can take a pause and think about those. I do have the answers on the next slide. So some of the advantages and disadvantages that I came up with is that cultural enclaves will provide familiar, comfortable, and supportive communities. And so when you are aging independently within an area that is surrounded by your culture, you will feel that you require less adaptation, right? You won't have to learn a new language. You won't have to learn any of the new concepts within your community. So it will feel more comfortable. And it's also an opportunity to just easily maintain someone's language and customs, especially if that's extremely important to you, right? So it is difficult to see individuals who don't speak English within a long-term care facility that is surrounded by individuals who speak English, right? They'll often get forgotten about, maybe become isolated. So cultural enclaves allow that ability to maintain language and customs. Whereas some of the disadvantages is that they won't feel they need to learn the language and customs of the wider society, right? So cultural enclaves can have some disadvantages in the sense that they might not venture outside of their small community. They might not venture to the wider society, which could lead them to be more vulnerable, especially if their community changes, which happens quite quickly, especially if you see how our housing market is. So communities do change. And so if we stay within our cluster, we might not venture out to the wider society and leave us to be more vulnerable. So ultimately, when we're looking at aging and healthcare and culture, what I've identified within this lecture is that we would need to understand language barriers and respect them, understand how individuals view certain cultural procedures within healthcare and understand them, and just know that there are different concepts in relation to disease in certain cultures, right? So we have to respect how people are choosing to age, how people are choosing to support their families in aging and healthcare, and just really opening up our eyes to all the different cultures that are out there and how they might view aging. And so with that being said, I look forward to reading every one of your journals, because it will be such an opportunity for me to learn about the different cultures and how they view aging. And so as you finish this lecture, just stop and just think about, what is your culture? What do you identify with? And then think about your grandparents or great grandparents and how they viewed aging versus maybe how you view aging. Right. And then at the same time, you can start to think about what you've witnessed and seen here in Canada versus what you've witnessed and seen in your own home country. What are some of those differences in aging and healthcare and culture? What are some of the similarities? So thank you for listening to this short, brief lecture on culture. Majority of your learning will actually occur in some of the attached articles in your journal. This is just an opportunity to provide just a basic understanding of what culture and aging is, but I think a lot of our learning will occur in our discussion boards, where we will discuss the different cultural views of and understandings of aging. So thanks very much, and I will see you guys next week.